Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. So pleased that you're here to join us. Today is a special presentation with HR Strategies Consulting. It is Navigating Uncertainty, Leadership Accountability in a Time of Crisis and Adversity with our guest presenter, Dr. Vince Molinaro, founder and CEO of Leadership Contract Inc. My name is Anissa Avon, and I'm the CEO of Turnkey Coaching Solutions, and I am super pleased to introduce you to Peter Santini and Dr. Vince Molinaro. So Peter, if you'll advance the slide to the next one, I want to tell folks about you, and we're going to get started right away. All right, Peter Santini is the Vice President of HR Management Consulting Practice of HR Strategies Consulting. Peter, well, goodness, that was not meant to be.
It always happens.
Peter is a dynamic, energetic, driven HR leader. He brings more than 34 years of experience in leading and building best practices into play in HR. And he's going to MC our host today. And so now I want to introduce you to our guest expert, Dr. Vince Molinaro. Dr. Molinaro is a global leadership advisor. He's a speaker, he's a researcher on leadership accountability, and he's the founder and CEO of Leadership Contract Inc. Dr. Molinaro travels worldwide to help organizations build what he calls vibrant leadership cultures and cultivate a culture of accountability in leadership. He is a New York Times bestselling author. He's published multiple books on the topic of leadership, including his recent book, Accountable Leaders, published by Wiley just this year. Congratulations, Dr. Vince. We also want to acknowledge some of his other books that I think you'll want to check out, The Leadership Contract and The Leadership Contract Field Guide. And then, of course, he's co-authored other books, including Leadership Solutions and The Leadership Gap. One thing that I think that he'll bring to bear in our presentation and our conversation today is specifically how many organizations are using his thought and his thoughts leadership as a foundation for their leadership development programs and their leadership competencies and how they benchmark their leaders' success. So Vince and Peter, you guys take it away. What are we going to learn today? And please fill in the gap on anything that I missed there.
Well, thanks, Anissa. Vince and I are looking forward to spending the next 35-40 minutes with everyone who decided to join us today to take you through this presentation. Our topic today, in the face of adversity, leaders may struggle to manage their teams effectively. Before the COVID-19 outbreak, over half of all professionals globally work remote for about 2.5 days a week. Since COVID-19, that's increased dramatically, with about 88% of organizations now insisting that their organizations work from home and to protect themselves and to adjust to the pandemic situation that we're currently in. Leaders needed to adapt. They need to learn how to do that, to be more flexible in the workplace, to help create a culture of accountability so that their organizations can weather this storm or COVID-19. However, even before the crisis, leaders struggle with accountability. Now, they must find new ways to step up when it matters most. So in this webinar, we'll explore what leaders at all levels must do to inspire a culture where everyone steps up and takes ownership. Sorry, went the wrong way. So in our discussion today, we're going to focus on understanding how the world has changed for leaders, discuss the need for strong leadership accountability, examine some global research on the state of leadership and accountability, both at a personal level and a cultural level, and explore some strategies and how to become more accountable leaders. And to lead us down this journey is Dr. Vince Molinaro, and I'm going to ask now Vince to take it over.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Anissa. Thanks for the opportunity. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being part of this session. So like all of us, you know, there was a defining moment in the middle of March when US President Donald Trump had his State of the Union address. And at that, as you recall, that evening, he basically said that he was stopping all travel from Europe into the US. And that was a holy cow moment for the world, because all of a sudden this became real in a very gripping way. And we've all seen the story play out. And as I sat there listening to my clients, senior leaders in HR and in the C-suite, what they were really kind of grappling with is how their world and how our world really became upended. And what we needed to figure out was how to lead in a world turned upside down. And that really is something that has kind of perpetuated itself and continued over the last few weeks and months. And now I'm starting to see a shift in how leaders are starting to think about coming out of this, the re-entry into whatever is going to be next. We're hearing a lot of language about this idea of the new normal. And I think that that's the wrong way to be thinking about that, because when I hear the term new normal, I sense that we're trying to go back to something. And I think we need to be thinking about the new realities, because when you think about new realities, it confronts you to having to deal with it. And that's something that we need to do. There may not be going back, there's going forward in a different way. So Peter, I'm going to ask you to advance the slide. And so the real question of my work as a leadership advisor is really helping companies. It's, you know, even for a long time has been, what does it really mean to be a leader today? And now this question has become even more critical. Whenever, as leaders, we face a significant shift in the nature of our business, you know, maybe there's a new strategy that needs to be executed. Maybe our company has brought in a new CEO. Maybe there's a new CHRO that's come in. Maybe there's an M&A event that's taking place and now a new company is forming. Whenever those significant events have happened, it really causes us to pause and reflect on, what do we need now from our leaders? What's the definition of leadership? And this has been a question that I've been exploring for the last decade in many ways, certainly coming out of the great financial crisis, when at that time we really saw a world gripped by leadership that led us down a path leading to one of the worst economic conditions that we had experienced in a long time. And at that moment in time, I began to see my clients really thinking hard about what's the kind of leadership we're going to need to lead ourselves through this and into the future. What I realized back then was something quite surprising. Many clients would say, you know what, we have many leaders who have never led through adversity. We've had 7 years of economic growth. It's all they know is good times. And now they're freaking out trying to deal with the adversity. That was back then. That was an economic crisis. And now we're dealing with an economic crisis and a global pandemic. And guess what? That same theme is emerging because our economy has been very robust for about 11 years. And if you were in your mid 30s or early 40s and joined the executive ranks, 11 years ago, you've had a pretty good run of growth and success. And many feel, at least the companies I'm talking to, seeing their leaders ill-equipped to deal with the current crisis because many leaders have never dealt with that kind of adversity. And so we have to pause, I think, at a personal level and answer this question for ourselves. What does it mean for you to be a leader today? How are you making sense of your role right now? And so we're going to make this a bit interactive. So what I'm going to ask you to do is in the chat box, just think about, what's the one word that best for you answers this question today, May 27th, 2020. What does it mean for you to be a leader today? So just take a moment in the chat. We'll make sure our moderators go through it. And what comes through? So Jennifer has an adaptability page guidance. Thank you. You can find the chat feature on the bottom of your screen. For me, it's certainly the word adversity is paramount for myself. Sheila, change, advocacy. Anissa, strength, the need for clarity. Nada, courage. The ability to pivot quickly. Some great words here. Perseverance. to be a generative leader, allowing, oh, now we're getting a whole flood coming through, hold on. Allowing generation of solutions from all others, really, really important at this time. Flexibility, reassurance, understanding all aspects of things, being able to be challenged, flexibility, collaborative. So what you begin to see through this list, thank you for doing this, is that the expectations of leaders continues to accelerate, continues to increase. And you know that because we're living through this. Peter, what would be your word?
Flexibility and challenge would be the two words that come to mind for me.
Yeah.
Being able to adapt in the changing environment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And quickly.
I did a survey on LinkedIn, among my network, and asked what are kind of the things that are challenging you the most right now. And the first two were dealing with the ambiguity and uncertainty of the conditions we find ourselves in. And so, to your point, not only do we need to be flexible and adaptable, we're having to do that in a very uncertain environment. And then the second item was having to make tough business decisions that for, if depending on the industry you're in and how how your company is being impacted by all things COVID-19, people know that there will be some tough decisions around, businesses to get out of, jobs that may need to be curtailed for a period of time or furloughed. And those are really challenging decisions that business leaders have to make, and why I think HR leaders have such a compelling opportunity to really help their companies lead and help their leaders lead at this time. John talks about embracing complexity and not just waiting for the fog to clear. That's such a great line. So thank you everyone for your thoughts. So the context has changed for us as leaders. How do we step up? We've got a sense of that. So let's continue, Peter, on the next slide. Yeah, so as I was saying, the expectations of leaders have always been great. So everything pre-COVID, this is what I have found in my research and in my writing is, we've had the pressure to differentiate our companies from our competitors, the pressure to execute strategy. A lot of the research is not compelling that shows most companies really struggle to execute their intended strategy. We need to lead transformational change. And that was a big priority for many, many companies before the global pandemic hit. Finding ways to create enduring value for shareholders, for various stakeholders, for the communities, and even for the planet. And then the always perpetual challenge and expectation around building future talent. So based on the conversations I have, what I hear is these are all still relevant, and now they've been amplified. And what my clients say to me is, and we need our leaders to be stronger than they've ever been, to not just lead in the moment, but lead us through this over the coming months or even years for that matter. But here's the challenge. When I looked at how satisfied are we with the extent that leaders are stepping up, the data is not great. It's not reassuring, it's not compelling. Some research reveals that 51% of leaders have actually checked out of their jobs. This was all pre-COVID. And at a time when we need leaders to be stronger, it seems to me, and I don't know if you feel this, but we've kind of had this pre-COVID amnesia. We kind of forgot the state of leadership before all of this happened and the state of employee engagement before all of this happened. Leadership was not as strong as we needed it to be. Employees were not as engaged. Only 25% of employees are ever fully engaged, what most of the research shows globally. And we've forgotten that that's kind of what we came into this global pandemic with, not the strongest bench strength that we needed. And now we have an opportunity to turn that around because we're going to need to turn that around. And so this ripple effect on leadership can either be positive if you're confident that you've got the leaders that you need, or it can be negative and really take you down a different direction. And so that's something that we've got to really own up to it and understand and think about where are we as an organization. Certainly the clients that I've worked with over the last few years have said to me, I am so glad we did this work on our leader population to strengthen them, because now I'm confident they're going to be ready to handle whatever COVID-19 brings. And so that is the rare examples. So let's continue for a second.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add on that in terms of COVID-19 or the pandemic is an external force both on organizations and globally. And the impact of that on leadership, specifically, as you said, going into this situation, the previous situation as we evolved into COVID-19, its leadership engagement was low. It just didn't automatically increase because of COVID-19. The organization was the organization, the culture was the culture that it was. So you're actually, in some cases, if you had the proper engagement, the proper leadership culture, you probably were able to manage COVID much more effectively. But most organizations aren't in that situation. And I've heard from clients as well, is that the culture and the readiness of the organization is just reflective of the fact that they weren't effective in the first place from a leadership perspective. So the external force of COVID has actually brought to light the situation from my interactions with a lot of clients.
Yeah, and you're so right. And certainly I've always looked at this issue of adversity because in one of my books, The Leadership Contract, I talk about this idea of a community of leaders. What's the culture that leaders create? And there's a sort of a 10-point scale that you can use to measure your leadership culture. And one of them is, in the face of adversities, do leaders come together? And a lot of times they say, yeah, we really come together. When something has hit us, we've kind of put all our differences aside and come together. In many ways, for a lot of leaders, sometimes they feel that it's only in adversity where they actually feel like they're really leading, which is fascinating. But I remember having that conversation with a group of leaders in Silicon Valley, and they were all feeling pretty proud of themselves that, yeah, we really seem to kind of come together. And the CEO, who was relatively new to the company, about 18 months in, said, well, from my perspective, I see something really different. I actually see that, adversity either can bring you together, but in most cases it tears you apart. And that's what I've also been seeing. And I don't know if you have, Peter, as I've been talking to clients and even talking to employees where they look up and see their leaders really struggling at this moment, and they don't see them coming apart or coming together. They really see them kind of coming apart, or they're at each other, and whatever dysfunctional issues were going on have just been amplified because of the pressure that everyone's feeling.
I agree. I've seen and heard the same thing from our clients as well.
Yeah. So let's continue. So here's kind of pre-COVID, because what is really the solution here? Well, the one thing that I've been looking at over the last few years is, as companies come to realize that the future will be more demanding and more challenging on leaders than ever before, and COVID is an example of that playing out in real time. So everything we thought could have happened, or may have possibly entertained could have happened, has happened. And now the question is, are leaders strong enough? And as I was looking at the gaps that people were talking about, what I began to see over and over again was that it wasn't just a gap around leadership. In fact, that term was actually too broad and maybe too generic. What I kept hearing was the sense of, we have people in leadership roles who don't fully understand what it means to be a leader, and they're not stepping up the way we need them to. And so when you kind of hear this over and over again, and over the last 5 years, I've traveled to 25 countries, over 80 cities, always talking about leadership and accountability, and it's remarkable how consistent the themes are. What we found in surveying over 3,000 senior executives worldwide is that 72% believe that leadership accountability is absolutely critical. We have to get it right. But only 31% are satisfied with the degree of accountability. And it doesn't matter where this data was collected, whether it was in North America, whether it was in Latin and South America, whether it was in New Zealand, Australia, Asia, APAC, Europe, the same themes emerged over and over again. That we need leaders to step up, they're not, and what's getting in the way. So let's continue. So what we found, and start to understand, so what could be getting in the way, is that in some cases, we do have people in leadership roles that we have to question, should they actually be in those roles? I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. But when we look at organizationally, what senior HR leaders and business executives said is there's a number of what I'm calling organizational or systemic weaknesses impacting the organization. So for example, only 49% of the organizations we surveyed around the world have actually set clear expectations of their leaders. That they've actually done the work to define, here's what it means to be a leader in our company. Here are the standards we are setting, and this is what we expect everyone in a leadership role to live up to. So when 50% have done that, only 50% have done that, that's a problem, because when you don't make it clear to leaders what it means to be a leader and where you're setting the bar, then either they're confused or they're trying their best to figure it out, but you're not going to be as effective as you need to be as an organization. When we ask, well, how many of your leaders do you feel are actually fully committed to their roles as leaders and fully accountable? They're estimating about 45%. And what's been interesting here is some other research done independently in an HBR article. It was pretty much the exact same number that they found. So there's a little bit of validation there. So we've got, about half of the organization setting clear expectations, and just under half of our leaders that we feel are actually stepping up. The next data point for me is the most concerning. When we ask, well, how confident are you that you have a strong leadership culture in place in your company? Only 27% believe that they did. And that's, to me, the most concerning gap, because what that indicates is that, an organization is at high risk in terms of when your leadership culture is not strong. It creates risk in executing your strategy. It creates risk in creating a compelling culture for your employees. And so this is something that worries me the most. And now the last point is really fascinating. We asked, well, does your organization, what do you do when you find a leader who's struggling in their role or maybe unaccountable or mediocre? What do? Do you address it? Only 20%, 1 in 5 said we actually do something about it. And I can't tell you how many sessions I've been into where leaders would say, we kind of know who they are, but we just don't know how to address it. So we just kind of leave them in their role, right? I even found in some organizations that they have a cultural history of taking people who are really poor leaders, and they don't want to address them or help them or exit them. And they move them into HR thinking that, well, at least we move them out of the business and we'll just put them on the sidelines in HR. Not realizing that HR is one of the most important functions in a company, and why would you want to have a mediocre leader in that function? That's just not a good strategy. So here's kind of something that we've got to think about. And what we've also seen is that there's a connection between leadership accountability and company performance. And what my research has found quite consistently is when you ask the respondents, is your company an industry leader? Compared to your key competitors, and has that been the case over the last 3 years? Or are you an average performer or a poor performer? When we looked at that data, we find that industry-leading companies report the highest level of satisfaction around leadership accountability and across all these 4 measures on here. So we see consistently that leadership accountability, when it is strong, drives strong company performance. And that, in many ways, is an obvious point, right? Because a group of mediocre leaders are never going to get you there. It just doesn't work. But truly accountable leaders will, and that is the way forward in many ways. let's just pause. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I was going to just add to the overall issue about, the systemic weakness in terms of additional statistics that we all know. Most top talent don't leave organizations for money or challenge. Number one reason is they leave is for poor managers or poor leaders that they have to deal with. So, consistently, this supports it organizationally and culturally. If your organization doesn't have strong leaders, strong managers, you're going to lose top talent. Yeah. And you can't move the organization forward and achieve goals with mediocre talent.
Yeah. And that's it's a great point, and that's sort of the collateral damage that happens. So Willis Towers Watson did a study a few years ago, and it was really fascinating. They looked at leader engagement, and they actually looked at when employees see their senior leaders and kind of that next level down, that mid-level leaders, when they see the kind of the large group of leaders in the organization working well together, employees' sense of employee engagement jumps to 72%. Just by them kind of looking around, hey, how are they doing? And they kind of go, okay, I'm feeling pretty good about this place. Boom, you got 72% engagement just based on that. You didn't have to buy any foosball tables. You didn't have to buy, you didn't have to provide free coffee. You don't need any of that stuff. Just by
ping pong tables.
Yeah, just by seeing strong leadership, engagement gets you to 72%. When they see senior leaders and other leaders not working well together, engagement drops to 8%. And so we haven't even been thinking about engagement and the connection to leadership, though we know it through our own lived experience. You know it yourself, right? When you've worked with a great leader who inspires you, you give that person everything you've got. And when you've worked with a leader who's been, mediocre, toxic, outright bad, you withhold the best of you, the best ideas and whatnot. There's a couple of comments that we might want to, Peter, have a look at, because there's some really interesting points made here.
Go for it.
Yeah, so Sheila says in reaction now, that means that leaders aren't meeting expectations, but they likely have no idea. And how do you meet the expectations that you don't know? That's exactly right, Sheila. Right. And that's the whole point, that sometimes people think, well, we don't have the right leaders. Well, that might be true, but have you done the things organizationally to help those leaders be successful? So exactly like on that slide, if you haven't set expectations, if you aren't supporting them, if you aren't creating a great culture, it's hard on your own to try to do that. And then mentioned that the difference between the 45% and the 27% is obvious because of the factor is missing, which is the strong leadership culture. Absolutely, absolutely right.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd like to add is in terms of, as you said, setting clear expectations for leaders, managers. Most organizations don't. Even a simple factor in terms of the way you do that, a lot of organizations don't make the expectation of leadership behaviors part of someone's performance evaluation. In terms of someone who is in a leadership position, they're not assessed against their behaviors as leaders. So if you're not measuring it and you're not giving feedback on it, it's highly likely you're going to get a continuous type of commitment to it, right?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. John adds, he says, expectations have changed. It's no longer paint by numbers. The numbers have all changed. The requirement is to lead in an adaptive instability. The qualities demand a higher level of kind of ego state development, the management of anxiety of complexity. You need to be transparent but courageous. And those expectations that John articulates there are absolutely right. So what it means to be a leader, it's more demanding, than ever before. So let's continue. I want to build off of these points. So what's the kind of way forward? So and Anissa had mentioned my books. There they are if you're interested or if you're aware of my body of work. But as I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we get through all of this, right? What's the way to get through it? And I've spent, pretty much my whole career as a leadership advisor. And leadership is one of the most popular topics that books get written about every single year. My publisher at Wiley, my editor, says, that next to romance novels and cookbooks, leadership books are the next most popular topic. So it's not like we have a shortage of great ideas. There's lots of great ideas. But as I thought about what was missing, right, I think something really, really fundamental is missing. And it's this idea tied to accountability, but it's this idea of a contract. And I call it a leadership contract. That what I've learned as I've traveled and talked to people is that as human beings, whenever we encounter someone who is a leader, whether they're a CEO, a senior executive, a manager, a team lead, whether they are the president of a country, the prime minister of a country, the mayor of a city, the governor of a state, the chief of the fire department, a religious leader, it doesn't matter what the leadership role is. We think leader, and as humans, we automatically expect more from them. We expect them to behave to a higher, to lead to a higher standard of behavior. And when they do, we're inspired by them. And when they don't, we're completely frustrated and quite disappointed. And so this idea of this automatic kind of expectation we have of anyone in a leadership role, to me implies that there is a contract, that whenever you take on a leadership role at any point in your life or in your career, you've actually signed up for something really important. And it's the leadership contract. But here's the challenge. When you ask leaders, as I've done everywhere I've been, I'm always curious. I ask a question, well, how did you get into a leadership role in the first place? Do you know what the number one answer is?
Luck.
No, actually, so well, it could be luck. It's to be honest, they'll say, I got in by accident. My manager just came to me one day and said, here, I need you to do this. Oh, and by the way, you got to manage these people. Good luck with that. We don't do a good job of supporting leaders when they assume new leadership roles, certainly at the front line. And now you're left kind of figuring out the role. Now, you stay in the role because you feel obligated to the organization. Yeah, that makes sense. You want to be a good employee. Those are the roles that have the cooler titles. Who doesn't want to be director or vice president of so-and-so? That's legitimate. Often those tracks pay more money, so who doesn't want to make more money? So you kind of feel like, yeah, I gotta keep doing this, right? And so that's the number one reason, by accident, or you were thrust into a role without really thinking about it. Holmes said she got pushed into the role. Then you've got number two is you were a strong technical performer, and Gallup's research has confirmed this. You were the best engineer, the best salesperson, the best analyst, the best accountant, the best marketer. It doesn't matter what the area of expertise is. When you excel at an individual, you stand out from everyone else. And we've gone to those people and say, you are so good at this. Now we're going to give you this job that's completely different, and good luck with that. And the third reason is tenure. You've just been around longer than everyone else. Well, let's give it to Mary. Let's give it to Bob. They've been with us for 15 years. They deserve it. Whether Mary or Bob even have the interest or the inclination to the role doesn't matter, right? And so what ends up happening because of that, invariably, we haven't thought of this as a contract on paper that you actually have to read and sign, really understand the terms and conditions. In fact, I believe we've treated it like an online contract. So, when you're online conducting any form of transaction, at some point in time, a window pops up with terms and conditions. And I don't know about you, but when I'm multitasking, I immediately see the window, I scroll down to the bottom, and I click agree. I know I am bound to something, but I didn't read anything on that screen, right? But I just click agree because I want to move on with my day. And that's what I think a lot of us have invariably done. And maybe when I started my career, a ton of years ago, when the world was a simpler place, when the expectations and demands of leadership were not as great as they are today, maybe it was okay to do it back then. But today, pre-COVID, and now in this world, it's not okay. And so I say to leaders, there is a contract, and it comes with 4 terms and conditions. And that's what you see on the right. The first says it's a decision you got to make. And if you know yourself well enough and know this is not for you, then say no. That's a good leadership decision. It may not be no forever, but if you're not up for it, then don't pretend, because you're not going to be successful. But if you are up for it, then you've got to be all in, fully committed to being the best leader that you can be. That it comes with obligation. And right now, the obligations on leaders are significant. They're, in some cases, they're figuring out how to, if you're an essential service, how to drive things. I've been chatting with an organization in the US that is in healthcare, but they're manufacturing ventilators. They're operating 24/7 at a pace that they've never seen before. That is one leadership challenge. And then you've got, companies that are in industries like travel, tourism, and others that have been devastated by COVID-19, and they're having a completely different leadership challenge. What's the obligation of leaders in those two scenarios? That the role is a lot of hard work, and then if you've been in a leadership role for any length of time, there's a lot of tough things you need to do. But what we find in practice is a lot of leaders wimp out on a lot of the tough things, particularly as it relates to people. They don't give candid feedback. They don't want to make unpopular decisions that are important to the company and the business, but it might make them, not liked by their employees, and we all like to be liked. They don't manage poor performers aggressively enough. This is something we've got to get better at. And that the new model is about community. It gets right back to that point around leadership culture. It's no longer about one person having all the answers. I don't think one person is going to figure out COVID-19. We need a lot of leaders coming together to manage some of the complexity and the uncertainty and the ambiguity that we're dealing with. So let's continue, Peter. So how does this all translate into how leaders need to show up? Well, my research shows there are 5 behaviors, and you'll see some common themes based on some of the comments you've provided. And so I'll spend just a minute on this, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So the first thing we find that accountable leaders do different than others is that they hold everyone to high standards of performance. So they make those absolutely clear. Here is where we are setting the bar, and I'm going to try to live up to that bar individually, and I expect you to. So that clarity of standards becomes important. Number 2, they have the courage to tackle tough issues and make difficult decisions. They don't wimp out on that stuff. 3, they're very good at communicating the strategy across the organization so that people have absolute clarity about what it is that they do every day and how it contributes to driving the success of a company. Number 4 is really important, particularly now. They express optimism about the company and its future, right? Have you ever worked for a leader who just shows up every day kind of dragging their heels, like they really don't want to be there? Imagine how inspiring it must be to work for that person. In contrary, for someone who's excited about the company, excited about the future, even in the midst of the challenges we face right now, people are looking to their leaders for hope, for a sense of we're going to get through this together, and that becomes important. And then they're very good at displaying clarity about the external trends in their business environment. So while they are heads down, executing on their priorities, they're not like an ostrich with their head in the ground. They kind of pull their head out every once in a while to try to anticipate what's coming. And today, that becomes even more critical. So Peter, I'll turn it over to you now, and curious to keep the conversation going. And
yes.
Your perspectives.
From a Q&A perspective. So if you do have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll answer that question, and if we can. But I'll start us off in terms of one of the key questions I thought would be interesting to start the conversation about the 5 characteristics. Vince and I have talked about this a few times, but one of the things that I asked him, and he said he'd try to answer this for us, was from those 5 characteristics, which 1 or 2 would you say is foundational that someone has to have for them to be building the correct foundation to be an accountable leader?
Yeah, I would say, the 5 are presented in that order because that's what the research revealed, right? That this is where we found the greatest net difference between the leaders that companies felt were accountable versus those that weren't. So I think the setting of standards becomes really, really important. Because if you don't set those high standards, right, you allow mediocrity to slip in. And, Seth Godin, the genius marketer, talks about, mediocrity is a slippery slope, right? You may just find yourself one day just slipping down and it's hard to kind of get out. So I would say that's important. The other thing that's really important is why this push on accountability. Why is that so critical? Because what I have found is, the literature in leadership will say, well, we need leaders to be authentic. Okay, I'm not sure what that really means. We need leaders, to be mindful. Okay, I got it. We need leaders to be good coaches. Yeah, I get that's important, right? And all of those things sometimes, or we need leaders to be inspirational, but some people are just naturally better at that than others. And I find that in my work with leaders, some of those concepts are confusing and people do not know how to get from point A to point B. Like, how do I become more authentic? How is that possible? What they also fail to realize is sometimes a leader who could be a tyrant or highly toxic can also be very authentic as a person. That's what you see and what you get. It's not necessarily effective from a leadership standpoint, but they would get top marks for being authentic. And so I think that's something that we've got to think about. So for me, it was like, what's the way for the vast majority of leaders to improve their leadership? And it's about accountability. We can all be more accountable. That's what I've learned in my own leadership roles, as a global senior executive and running my own companies, is if I'm really honest with myself, I can always see room for me to demonstrate more accountability. Even though I take it seriously, I could be more. And that to me is that if you invest in those 5 behaviors, for example, you can get yourself quite a long ways in terms of your effectiveness as a leader.
That totally makes sense. And I think by also doing that, the other thing that happens if someone's striving to be more of an accountable leader, they have to be vulnerable. They have to be open. They have to be willing to look at themselves and say, this is where my strengths and my weaknesses are, and I'm ready to address them. Have you find in your work that some leaders are more adaptable to that and some resist and therefore can't make that transition?
Well, it's so critical, right? Because if you're not open to feedback, if you're not engaged or you're not able to go through that kind of process, then you run the risk of really fooling yourself, right? You run the risk of thinking you're better than you really are. And then the second you're doing that, you're actually not being accountable. You're really absolving some of that accountability. So, you do see that all the time. And, like others, like you and I think others on this session have also found, is that when you see a leader who genuinely demonstrates that openness, that desire to get feedback, that ability to learn and to change, you can just see the example they set for everyone else, right? And that becomes important. And Lisa asks a question regarding accountability. Says many leaders believe they're holding their people accountable when in fact it's weak in some cases, or they might be micromanaging. What's the difference in terms of effective accountability? So this is a great point. And in my new book, Accountable Leaders, which will be out in a couple of weeks, I spent some time thinking about it because I think when we talk accountability, I've found as I've traveled globally, is actually a very loaded word. It means different things in different cultures. In fact, when I was in Spain and Latin and South America, what I came to realize was that they had said to me, Vince, we don't have the word accountability in the Spanish language. But based on your work and your research, we've got accountability gaps in our companies. So imagine when you don't even have a word to describe this idea, right? But what I've also found is we have this sense that accountability, at least some managers believe, it's what they do to others. It's like you can imagine someone with that big finger pointing at their employee, like, I'm holding you accountable. And what I'm saying is, yeah, you can take that approach, but a more lasting approach is you need to inspire accountability. You need to set the tone of accountability, because if you set that tone, right, that becomes important. It goes back to that notion of standards, right? I can set high standards for everyone else and then not live up to them myself. Now I've created double standard, right? Or I may be a leader that have no standards or absolutely accepts low standards, which isn't a formula for success. So I think that becomes important. Alyssa asked, how do you differentiate accountability of leaders to delegation? That's an interesting question. Without knowing more of kind of what you're getting at, I would say, really delegation is really being clear on what you need your people to do by when, and kind of what success looks like. So a delegation, if it's done effectively, should drive accountability at the employee level. John adds, saying "I don't know" is not necessarily a sign of weakness, and can well be the opportunity to hold the team accountable to develop the solutions. It's the opportunity to broaden accountability and expectation. Yeah, I don't know. I know, Peter, for you, you've always shared with me that one of the most important things you've learned is also say, "I need your help."
Yep.
Right. And so the second you say, "I need your help," means I don't got this. And that's really empowering to someone when you have a leader who can admit that they don't know. Like back to the earlier point, in this world that we're facing right now in the global pandemic, who has all the answers? I'm not sure any of us do. We've got it. We're figuring out the answers collectively as we work through this at an individual, with our families, at a company, at a country level as well.
True. Those are all valid points. And back to your point when you talked about the word accountability in different languages, I was just curious in terms of when you were dealing with them in Spanish, what did they ended up using in terms of something that was able to communicate the meaning that you were trying to help them ascertain?
Yeah, it's a great point. They just ended up using the word accountability.
So they created it.
Yeah, because they understood what it meant in English, but they didn't have it in Spanish. And the book's been translated into Spanish, and we've done a lot of programs in Spanish-speaking countries. And so it's interesting that people can kind of still get the concept, even though they don't have a word for it. And the Spanish language isn't the only one.
Right.
So in another example, in Italy, they have the word accountability, but it really means, it really has a blaming nature to the definition. So it really is, if something hits the fan, who are we holding accountable to blame?
And I think that's the underlying premise there. The word accountability might have some negative connotation because it's been used historically to put blame on someone versus to build them up and say, thank you for taking responsibility. Thank you for doing the things that you're supposed to do. It's always been, oh, something went wrong. Who's accountable for it?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that shift of perception is necessary from that perspective. So we've got a couple minutes left. If there's any other questions, that would be great. I think we have one from Nada. Accountability and lead is more about trust building by delivering your commitments. Walk your walk, talk your talk. Believing in your own product, which we want to sell, convince to our customers, client. Delegation is more about developing the other person.
That is awesome. I have nothing to add. That's really a great point. Thank you, Nada.
Perfect. So yeah, I think we're kind of. Anything else you want to add, Vince, before we sign off?
No, I just thank you, Anissa and team, for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for engaging in the conversations. You can track me down on LinkedIn if you're interested. And wishing you all the best at this time, and thank you for an engaging discussion.
Thanks, Vince, for taking us through this session. Insightful, and your knowledge and experience is very useful in terms of helping organizations to find out where their leadership culture is and what things they can do to improve that leadership culture. And thank you, Anissa, for introducing us. And we wish everyone stay safe in this COVID-19 and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both, guys. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.